In the late 1800s, the Russian Empire built a massive fortress in an unlikely place, the middle of swamps and marshlands near the Bibaza River. They called it Oswiec Fortress. It took 10 years to build, from 1882 to 1892. The location seemed strange at first, but it was brilliant strategy. The fortress sat just 50 kilometers from the German border, in the only spot where the marshlands could be crossed. A vital railway line ran straight through it, connecting important cities. Any army wanting to invade Russia from the west would have to go through Oswiec. The fortress had thick stone walls, defensive trenches, and battlements where soldiers could fire down on attackers while staying protected. It wasn't the prettiest fortress, but it was tough. When World War I began in August 1914, Germany knew they had a problem: Oswiec Fortress. It blocked their path into Russia like a locked door they couldn't open. In September 1914, the German 8th Army attacked with 40 infantry battalions. They heavily outnumbered the Russian defenders, but the fortress design was too strong. Attackers had to cross 2 sets of trenches and barbed wire before even reaching the walls. Those who made it that far were easily shot by Russian soldiers firing from protected positions above. The Germans failed and retreated. They tried again in February 1915 with heavy artillery, bombarding the fortress for 2 weeks straight. The walls cracked and buildings crumbled, but the defenders held firm. Again, the Germans failed. The fortress seemed impossible to capture. By July 1915, Germany was desperate. They assigned their best military leader to the job, Field Marshal Paul von Hindenburg, one of Germany's most respected commanders. Hindenburg arrived with overwhelming force: 14 infantry battalions, a battalion of combat engineers, 24 to 30 massive siege guns, and 30 artillery batteries. Inside the fortress, only about 900 Russian soldiers waited, 500 men from the 226th Infantry Regiment Zemlyansky, and 400 militia volunteers. The Russians were outnumbered nearly 8-1, but Hindenburg brought something else, something the Russians had never faced before. He brought 30 batteries equipped with poison gas, chlorine and bromine gas stored in special cylinders. The Germans had used gas successfully on the Western Front. Now they would use it here. Gas warfare was terrifyingly new in 1915. Poison gas was invisible death that floated on the wind. Chlorine gas was especially deadly. When you breathed it, it mixed with moisture in your lungs to create hydrochloric acid. Your lungs literally dissolved from the inside. You drowned in your own blood and destroyed tissue. It was an agonizing death that could take minutes or hours. The Germans had used over 150 tons of chlorine gas at Ypres in Belgium just months earlier, killing thousands of French and British soldiers. The Russian defenders at Oswiec had heard rumors about this terrible weapon, but they'd never experienced it. They had no gas masks, no protective equipment. Their only defense was wet cloth held over their faces, which barely helped. The Germans positioned their gas cylinders along the front lines and waited. Gas warfare had one critical requirement: the wind had to blow in the right direction, carrying the poison toward the enemy, not back toward your own troops. For days, Hindenburg's men checked the wind direction constantly. They couldn't attack until conditions were perfect. Finally, in the early morning hours of August 6, 1915, the wind shifted. It was blowing directly toward the Russian fortress. At 4:00 a.m., the order was given. German artillery began a massive bombardment to distract the defenders. At the same time, soldiers opened the gas cylinders. A greenish-yellow cloud began rolling across no man's land toward Oswiec Fortress. The Russian soldiers on watch saw something that filled them with terror: a thick yellow-green fog creeping toward them across the ground. It moved slowly but steadily, driven by the wind. It had a strange, sweet smell mixed with something harsh like bleach. Some soldiers shouted warnings. Others grabbed whatever cloth they could find, soaking it in water or even urine, and held it to their faces. But it was too late. The gas cloud rolled over the fortress walls like a ghostly wave. Within minutes, Hundreds of Russian soldiers were choking, gasping, collapsing. Their eyes burned. Their throats felt like fire. They coughed violently, bringing up blood and pieces of their own lung tissue. The gas was so concentrated that it killed plants and turned the grass yellow. For over an hour, the poison cloud hung over Oswijk Fortress. The German artillery stopped firing. Everything went quiet except for the occasional cough or scream from inside the fortress walls. German soldiers, wearing their gas masks that made them look like monsters with bug eyes and tubes, watched and waited. They knew no one could survive that much gas. The German officers were confident. They deployed enough chlorine and bromine to kill everyone in the fortress 10 times over. According to their calculations, every Russian soldier should be dead. At around 11:00 a.m., when the gas had finally cleared enough, Hindenburg gave the order. 7,000 German infantry soldiers began marching toward the fortress to claim their easy victory. Inside the fortress, hell had come to earth. Bodies lay everywhere. Most defenders had died quickly from the gas. Others were still dying, drowning in their own blood as their lungs dissolved. But incredibly, impossibly, about 100 men were still alive. They shouldn't have been. The gas should have killed them all. Some had managed to get to areas where the gas was slightly less concentrated. Others had wet cloths that filtered just enough gas to keep them breathing barely. These survivors were in horrible condition. Their skin was covered in chemical burns and blisters. They coughed up blood constantly, along with chunks of their own destroyed lung tissue. Their eyes were red and streaming tears. They could barely stand. They were, for all practical purposes, walking dead men. Among the survivors was Second Lieutenant Vladimir Kotlinski, just 21 years old. He looked around at his dying men and the approaching German army. Every logical thought said they should surrender or wait for death. They were finished. They'd done their duty. No one could ask more of men who'd been gassed, but Kotlinski made a different choice. He and about 60 other survivors who could still stand grabbed their rifles. They wrapped bloody rags around their faces. They fixed their bayonets, long blades attached to the end of rifles for close combat. Kotlinski gave a simple order: "We charge." Someone blew a whistle. The gates opened, and approximately 100 Russian soldiers who should have been dead began walking out of the fortress towards 7,000 German soldiers. Imagine what the German soldiers saw that morning. They were marching confidently toward a silent fortress, expecting to find only corpses. Then they heard a whistle, movement at the gates. Figures emerged from the poisonous haze still hanging over the fortress walls. But these weren't normal soldiers. These were monsters from a nightmare. The Russian soldiers were wrapped head to toe in bloody bandages and torn cloth. Their faces were covered in blisters and chemical burns. Their skin was peeling off in sheets. As they walked forward, they coughed violently, spitting blood and pieces of their own lungs onto the ground. Their eyes showed a terrifying rage, the fury of men who have nothing left to lose. They moved slowly but deliberately, like zombies rising from graves. The German soldiers froze. These were experienced troops who'd seen terrible things in war, but nothing like this. The sight of the dead men walking toward them, bleeding from every pore, coughing up their own organs, was too much for the human mind to process. Someone screamed. Then panic spread like wildfire through the German ranks. 7,000 soldiers, trained, armed, wearing protective gas masks, broke and ran from 100 dying men. Officers shouted orders, but no one listened. The Germans turned and fled in total chaos. In their panic, hundreds of soldiers tripped over their own barbed wire defenses and fell into their own trenches. Some were trampled by their fleeing comrades. The attack of the dead men had become a rout. The Russian survivors didn't just walk forward, they charged. Despite coughing blood, despite barely being able to breathe, despite skin falling off their bodies, they ran at the retreating Germans with bayonets and rage. Lieutenant Kotlinski led the charge, his voice hoarse from gas damage but still shouting encouragement to his men. The few Germans who stood their ground and tried to fight were quickly overwhelmed. The Russians fought with the desperate fury of men who knew they were already dead. They had nothing to lose and everything to prove. For a brief, terrible moment, the fortress that Germany thought it had conquered became a slaughterhouse. The Germans who didn't run fast enough paid the price. The charge by Kotlinski and his dying men bought precious time. Russian artillery crews who'd been protected in fortified positions or had managed to survive the gas attack ran to their guns. These soldiers, though also affected by the gas, began firing at the fleeing German forces. Artillery shells exploded among the retreating troops, adding to the chaos and carnage. Machine guns that had been silent during the gas attack suddenly came to life, cutting down Germans as they ran. What was supposed to be an easy German victory had become a disaster. The attack of the dead men wasn't just a terrifying charge. It was the signal for every surviving Russian defender to fight back with everything they had left. By noon on August 6, 1915, the German attack had completely collapsed. Thousands of soldiers who'd confidently marched toward an empty fortress were now running for their lives. The German commanders were stunned and humiliated. Field Marshal Hindenburg, one of Germany's greatest military minds, had been defeated by dying men who shouldn't have been able to stand, let alone fight. The Germans retreated to their starting positions and regrouped. They'd lost hundreds of men killed, wounded, or captured. The psychological damage was even worse. Soldiers whispered about zombies and ghosts. Some refused to attack the fortress again, claiming it was cursed. The Battle of Oswijk had become the stuff of nightmares. After the Germans retreated, the surviving Russians assessed the damage. It was catastrophic. Hundreds of defenders lay dead from the gas attack. The fortress itself was heavily damaged from months of bombardment, and the men who'd participated in the charge weren't celebrating. They were dying. Lieutenant Vladimir Kotlinski, the young hero who'd led the charge, succumbed to his injuries soon after. Most of the other chargers also died within hours or days. The gas had destroyed their lungs so badly they couldn't survive. Of the approximately 100 men who'd made the charge, very few lived more than a week. They'd won the battle but paid for it with their lives. Their sacrifice had given Russia time but cost them everything. Despite their losses, the Russians who survived the gas attack, those who'd been in protected areas or got lucky, continued defending Oswijk Fortress. Russian reinforcements arrived and retook positions that the Germans had briefly captured during the chaos. For nearly 2 more weeks, the battered fortress held. The Germans were hesitant to attack again. The memory of the dead men rising to fight was too fresh, too terrifying. But everyone knew the situation was hopeless. The fortress was too damaged. The garrison was too weak, and the larger war situation had changed. Russian forces across the entire front were retreating. Oswijk Fortress was becoming isolated and surrounded. The defenders had done their duty magnificently, but they couldn't hold forever. On August 18, 1915, 12 days after the attack of the dead men, the Russian commanders made a difficult decision. They ordered the fortress abandoned, but they wouldn't leave it intact for the Germans to use. Russian engineers spent the night setting explosive charges throughout Oswijk. They planted dynamite in the walls, the towers, the underground passages, and the ammunition storage. At dawn on August 19, the last Russian defenders marched out of the fortress they'd held for so long. Then the engineers pushed the detonator. Massive explosions rocked the fortress. Walls collapsed. Towers crumbled. By the time the smoke cleared, Oswijk Fortress was a ruin. The Germans could have the land, but they'd get nothing useful from it. German forces cautiously entered the ruins of Oswijk Fortress days later, half expecting more dead men to rise and attack them. They found only rubble and bodies. The fortress that had cost them so much time, effort, and blood was now just broken stone and twisted metal. They'd technically won. They controlled the ground, but it was a hollow victory. The fortress was useless as a defensive position. The railway still ran through the area, which was valuable, but the strategic strong point was gone. More importantly, the story of the attack of the dead men spread through the German army like wildfire. Soldiers told and retold the story, each version becoming more nightmarish. It became a cautionary tale about Russian determination and the horrors of modern warfare. After the war, the attack of the dead men became legendary. Russian historians and soldiers told the story with pride, a tale of incredible courage in the face of impossible odds. But some historians question the details. Did it really happen as described? Were the Russians really coughing up pieces of their lungs? Did 100 men really scare away 7,000? In the 2000s, researchers found the 226th Infantry Regiment's official logbook in Russian archives. It confirmed the basic facts. The gas attack happened at 4:00 a.m. on August 6, 1915. About 100 men did survive and counterattack. The Germans did retreat in panic. The logbook recorded that 7 out of 8 high-ranking officers died from the gas, along with an estimated 200 to 400 soldiers total. How did anyone survive such a deadly gas attack? Scientists later studied what happened at Oswiec. The wet cloths that some Russian soldiers used did help slightly. They filtered some of the gas and reduced how much entered the lungs. Some areas of the fortress had better air circulation, meaning less concentrated gas. Some soldiers were simply in the right place at the right time, in pockets where the wind didn't carry as much gas. But the main reason some men survived long enough to fight was sheer will. Their bodies were shutting down, their lungs were dissolving, but their minds refused to quit. Adrenaline, determination, and rage kept them moving when their bodies should have collapsed. It was the human will to fight back that made the impossible possible. The Battle of Oswiec demonstrated the absolute horror of chemical warfare. Poison gas didn't discriminate. It killed young and old, brave and coward, friend and foe if the wind shifted. It was a weapon that caused unimaginable suffering. Soldiers who survived gas attacks often had permanent lung damage, blindness, and other health problems for the rest of their lives. The international community was so horrified by gas warfare that in 1925, nations signed the Geneva Protocol banning the use of chemical weapons. Unfortunately, that didn't stop future uses. Chemical weapons were used in World War II, the Iran-Iraq War, and in various conflicts since. But Oswiec Fortress remains one of the most dramatic examples of gas warfare's effects and the human cost of such weapons. Second Lieutenant Vladimir Kotlinski and the other defenders of Oswiec Fortress were largely forgotten for decades. The Russian Revolution of 1917 and then World War II pushed their story into the shadows. But in the 21st century, interest in World War I increased. Historians rediscovered the attack of the dead men. In 2014, Russian heavy metal band Aria released a song called Attack of the Dead about the battle. In 2019, Swedish metal band Sabaton released their own version, Attack of the Dead Men, which became hugely popular and introduced millions of people worldwide to the story. Video games featured the battle. Films and documentaries told the story. Finally, the defenders were getting the recognition they deserved. Today, the ruins of Oswiec Fortress still stand in northeastern Poland. It's a historical monument and tourist site. Visitors can walk through the broken walls and crumbling towers. Information plaques tell the story of the fortress's defense and the attack of the dead men. Polish and Russian historians work together to preserve the site and honor all who fought there, regardless of which side they were on. The fortress is a reminder of the horrors of war and the courage of soldiers caught in impossible situations. Every August 6, small commemorations are held to remember what happened there on that terrible morning in 1915. The dead men have not been forgotten. The attack of the dead men teaches several important lessons. First, the human spirit is capable of extraordinary things when pushed to extremes. Second, weapons designed to remove humanity from war, like poison gas, often fail because they can't account for human determination. Third, victory isn't always about who has the best weapons or the most soldiers. Sometimes it's about who refuses to give up. The Germans had every advantage, more troops, better weapons, poison gas, but they lost to dying men who simply refused to surrender. Finally, the story reminds us that history is full of incredible true stories that sound too amazing to be real. Sometimes truth is stranger than any fiction we could imagine. The attack of the dead men remains one of the most astonishing moments in military history. It's a story that bridges the gap between history and horror, between reality and nightmare. On August 6, 1915, approximately 100 Russian soldiers who should have been dead rose from the poison fog and charged an army. They were bleeding, burned, coughing up their own lungs, and they won. They saved their fortress, if only temporarily. They bought time for their comrades. Most importantly, they proved that courage isn't about having no fear. It's about fighting even when you know you're already doomed. Vladimir Kotlinsky and his fellow defenders became literal ghosts who fought back. They died, but they died fighting, and their story lives on. Sometimes, the strongest weapon isn't a gun or a bomb. It's the refusal to surrender, even to death itself.